$10,000 vintage red pooled like blood around Penelope's scuffed shoes after the crystal glass shattered against the marble floor. She hadn't meant to violently knock it from his hand, but catching the scent of bitter almond laced in the Merlot meant she had just saved his life. Only for his fiancée to immediately demand, "Arrest that fat bitch for attempted murder." In the opulent, cutthroat world of the East Coast elite, being a size 18 makes a person entirely invisible. To the billionaires, politicians, and underground syndicate bosses who frequented the Belvedere Club in Manhattan, she wasn't Penelope Gallagher, the woman with the most refined palate on the eastern seaboard. She was just the heavy-set sommelier who faded into the flocked velvet wallpaper, a useful but aesthetically displeasing fixture in their world of razor-thin supermodels and tailored Italian suits. Her invisibility was usually her greatest asset. It allowed her to stand in the corners of grand ballrooms and private cigar smoke-filled studies, listening to secrets that could topple fortunes. But tonight, that invisibility was about to become her absolute downfall. The event was the engagement gala of Arthur Costello. Arthur was the undisputed king of the Chicago-New York supply routes, a mafia boss who operated with the ruthless precision of a Fortune 500 CEO. He was devastatingly handsome, with calculating grey eyes and a jawline that looked carved from granite. But he was marrying Victoria Hastings, a woman whose beauty was only matched by her venom. Victoria was a scion of a rival family, a strategic merger disguised as a romance. She was a size 0, dripping in Cartier, with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. And she despised Penelope. "Make sure the vest is actually buttoned this time, Penelope," Victoria had hissed at her earlier in the evening, her manicured nails tapping against her champagne flute. "We don't need the guests losing their appetites looking at your spillage." Penelope had bitten the inside of her cheek, nodding politely. "Of course, Miss Hastings." She didn't care about Victoria's petty cruelties. Her focus was the wine. Tonight, she was tasked with opening and serving a crown jewel, a 1947 Cheval Blanc, requested specifically by Arthur to toast his new alliance. It was a masterpiece of a vintage, requiring the utmost care, decanting, and temperature control. The grand ballroom of the Costello estate in upstate New York was buzzing with over 200 guests. Chandeliers cast golden light over the imported marble. Armed guards in tuxedos stood by the exits, a silent reminder of who these people really were. At the stroke of midnight, she wheeled the antique mahogany cart toward the head table. The Cheval Blanc was resting beautifully in the crystal decanter. She approached Arthur, who was deep in conversation with a senator, while Victoria clung to his arm like a decorative vine. "Mr. Costello," she murmured softly, not wanting to interrupt, but knowing the schedule. "The Cheval Blanc." Arthur paused, turning his steely gaze to her. For a fraction of a second, he looked at her, really looked at her, not with the disgust his fiancée harbored, but with a quiet, analytical respect. "Thank you, Penelope. Proceed." She poured a tasting measure into a pristine crystal goblet. As per protocol, she didn't taste it herself. This bottle was too rare, too expensive. But as she lifted the glass to hand it to him, her hand passed under her face. Her breath caught. A sommelier's nose is their livelihood. She could detect the difference between French and American oak from 3 feet away. She could smell the soil composition in a Pinot Noir. But what she smelled now wasn't blackberries, leather, or aged tannins. It was faint, almost imperceptible beneath the robust alcohol. But it was there, a sharp, synthetic edge, the distinct metallic sweetness of bitter almonds, laced with a harsh, floral undertone that reminded her of crushed oleander. Cyanide. Specifically, a fast-acting hydrocyanic compound, often masked in heavy liqueurs, but nearly impossible to hide in a delicate, aged wine if you knew what to look for. Arthur was reaching for the glass. His fingers brushed the stem. "To us, darling," Victoria purred, raising her own glass of champagne. "If he drinks this, he will be dead before the glass hits the table." Penelope's mind raced. If she spoke up, they wouldn't believe her. If she hesitated, he would swallow it. There was no time for protocol. There was no time for respect. Her heavy, clumsy body, the one Victoria mocked, lunged forward. She slammed her palm into the crystal goblet just as it reached Arthur's lips. The glass exploded. The ruby liquid splashed across Arthur's pristine white tuxedo shirt, across the silk tablecloth, and splattered onto Victoria's custom Dior gown. The sound of the shattering glass echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous ballroom. The music stopped instantly. 200 heads turned. Within a millisecond, the distinct sound of a dozen safety catches. Clicking off filled the air as Arthur's guards drew their concealed weapons. Arthur stood frozen, staring at his ruined shirt, then down at Penelope. She was on her knees, her chest heaving, a piece of glass embedded in her palm, bleeding onto the marble. "What the hell is the meaning of this?" Arthur's voice was dangerously low, a rumbling thunder before a storm. Before she could open her mouth to explain, a high-pitched, hysterical scream ripped through the silence. "She tried to kill him!" Victoria shrieked, pointing a trembling, diamond-clad finger directly at Penelope's face. I saw her slip something into the decanter." The ballroom erupted into chaos. "No!" Penelope gasped, clutching her bleeding hand to her chest. "No, Mr. Costello. You don't understand. The wine was—" "Shut up!" Victoria screamed, stepping forward and slapping Penelope across the face so hard her vision blurred. "You jealous, deranged cow! I knew you were obsessed with him. I told you, Arthur. I told you she was unstable. Look at her, a pathetic, fat nobody who thought she could take out the head of the Costello family just because she can't have him." It was a masterclass in manipulation. Victoria was leaning perfectly into the stereotypes of this shallow world. To them, it made total sense. Of course, the heavy, unattractive servant was a bitter, unhinged woman capable of poisoning a mafia boss out of sheer, pathetic jealousy. Who would question it? She gave them a narrative that fit their prejudices perfectly. "Victoria, step back," Arthur commanded. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried absolute authority. He looked down at Penelope, his grey eyes searching her terrified face. "Penelope, why did you break the glass?" It smelled off," she stammered, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Bitter almonds, oleander. It's poisoned, Mr. Costello. I swear to you I didn't put it there. I smelled it when I went to hand it to you." Victoria let out a theatrical, mocking laugh. "She smelled it? She expects us to believe her fat nose detected poison in a 70-year-old wine? She's lying, Arthur. Look at her shaking." She dropped the poison in when she was wheeling the cart over. I literally saw her hand hovering over the decanter. "I was decanting it," Penelope pleaded, tears of sheer panic pricking her eyes. "Enough," said Lorenzo, Arthur's towering head of security, stepping up beside her. He didn't gently escort her. He grabbed a fistful of her uniform collar and hauled her to her feet with terrifying ease. "Boss, what do you want to do?" Arthur stared at the spilled wine soaking into the carpet. He looked at Victoria, who was crying perfect, delicate tears, trembling in the arms of her brother, Liam. Then he looked at Penelope. "Take her down to the cellar," Arthur said coldly. "Don't let her speak to anyone." "Arthur, she needs to be handed over to the police," Victoria insisted, though there was a frantic edge to her voice now. "She needs to be arrested immediately." "This is family business, Victoria," Arthur replied, not looking at her. "Lorenzo, the cellar, now." Lorenzo dragged Penelope backward. She kicked, she screamed, she pleaded, but her voice was lost in the murmurs of the horrified guests. She was hauled out of the glittering ballroom, through the heavy oak doors, and down into the bowels of the estate. The Costello mansion was built during Prohibition. Its wine cellars were vast, stone-lined labyrinths that had historically been used for far more than storing Pinot Noir. Lorenzo threw her onto the damp, cold flagstones of an empty storage room. The iron door slammed shut behind her, the lock turning with a heavy final clack. Total darkness. She curled into a ball on the freezing floor, clutching her bleeding hand. The pain in her palm was nothing compared to the terror gripping her chest. She was a dead woman. You don't attempt to assassinate a mafia boss and live to see a courtroom. Victoria had set her up flawlessly. She knew exactly what she was doing. The realization hit her like a freight train. Victoria poisoned the wine. She was the only one who had access to the cart before Penelope wheeled it out. She had intentionally distracted Penelope with her cruel comments about her body to buy herself the few seconds she needed to drop the liquid cyanide into the decanter. It was a coup. She was going to kill Arthur on their engagement night, solidify her family's dominance, and blame it on the disgruntled, overweight servant who no one would ever care to investigate. Hours passed in the pitch black. The cold seeped into her bones. Penelope cried until she had no tears left, berating herself for her own instincts. If she had just let him drink it, she wouldn't be down here. But she couldn't do it. Despite who he was, Arthur Costello had never treated her like a piece of furniture. He had always said, "Please and thank you." He had recognized her talent. That basic human decency had just cost her her life. Suddenly, the heavy iron lock grated. The door swung open, blinding her with the harsh yellow light of the hallway. She scrambled backward, pressing her back against the damp stone wall, bracing for Lorenzo and his brass knuckles. But it wasn't Lorenzo. It was Arthur. I was alone. He had stripped off his ruined tuxedo jacket and the blood-red stained shirt. He wore only a black undershirt, highlighting the dark ink of mafia tattoos crawling up his muscular arms. He held a high-powered flashlight in one hand and a single, pristine wine glass in the other. He stepped into the cell and closed the door behind him, leaving them in the dim glow of the flashlight he set on a barrel. He didn't look like a man coming to execute a traitor. He looked completely, utterly rattled. He crouched down to her eye level. She flinched, turning her face away. "Look at me, Penelope," he said. His voice was quiet. She slowly turned her head. He held up the empty wine glass. "After Lorenzo brought you down here, Victoria demanded we throw out the decanter. She said it was evidence that she couldn't bear to look at it. She pushed one of the waiters to dump it in the sink. She held her breath. Before he could, Arthur continued, his jaw tightening. My dog, Brutus. He licked up the wine you spilled on the floor. Penelope's stomach dropped. Brutus was a massive 120-pound cane corso. Arthur loved that dog more than most of his associates. Is he? She whispered. Dead, Arthur said, the word hanging in the cold, damp air like a death sentence. Massive cardiac arrest, 3 minutes after ingesting it. He stared at her, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her shiver. You didn't put it in there, Arthur stated, a cold realization dawning in his eyes. You couldn't have. You were completely out of range of the cart when the decanter was filled, and the security footage from the hall confirms it. Which means... Victoria, she whispered, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. Arthur let out a slow, ragged breath, running a hand over his face. The untouchable Mafia Boss suddenly looked very human and very betrayed. She played me. She played all of us. She used you as the perfect, disposable scapegoat. He reached out, and for a terrifying second, Penelope thought he was going to hit her. Instead, his large, warm hand gently took her bleeding one. He inspected the deep cut from the broken glass. You saved my life, Penelope, Arthur said softly, looking up into her eyes. And in return, my fiancé ordered you thrown in a dungeon. A dark, lethal shadow crossed his face, a terrifying glimpse of the monster that ruled the underworld. Let's go upstairs. It's time we correct the narrative. Arthur didn't pull her to her feet. He offered her his hand, wrapping his large, calloused fingers around her uninjured wrist to hoist her up gently. The cold of the cellar was immediately replaced by the radiating heat of his body. Lorenzo, Arthur spoke into the darkness. From the shadows of the stairwell, the towering head of security materialized. He took one look at Arthur's face and immediately straightened his posture, sensing the deadly shift in the atmosphere. The dog? Lorenzo asked, his voice a gravelly whisper. Dead, Arthur replied flatly. Victoria laced the Cheval Blanc. She used Penelope to mask the hit. Lorenzo's eyes widened a fraction before narrowing into lethal slits. Say the word, boss. She won't make it to the driveway. No, Arthur raised a hand. Richard Hastings has 80 men heavily armed on the perimeter, and Donatelli is upstairs representing the commission. If we put a bullet in Victoria now, we start a war that ends with half of New York burning. We need to dissect her publicly. First, I need to take care of our guest. He placed a hand on the small of her back, a touch that sent a jolt of electricity straight through her spine, and guided her past Lorenzo. They didn't go back up to the ballroom. Instead, Arthur led her through a hidden service elevator that bypassed the main floors, depositing them directly into his private penthouse suite. The contrast to the cellar was staggering. The suite smelled of rich mahogany, expensive leather, and Arthur's bespoke Tom Ford cologne. He guided her into an opulent, marble-lined bathroom and sat her down on the edge of a clawfoot tub. Hold still, he murmured, pulling a first aid kit from the cabinet. She sat frozen, watching this feared syndicate boss carefully clean the blood from her palm. She was a size 18, constantly tugging at her uniform, painfully aware of how much space she took up in a room. Men like Arthur Costello didn't look at women like her. They dated the Victorias of the world, sharp, thin, and hollow. Yet as he meticulously picked a tiny shard of crystal from her flesh with a pair of tweezers, his focus was entirely on her. "Why didn't you let me drink it?" he asked suddenly, applying antiseptic to the wound. "You knew Victoria set you up to take the fall. If I had died, she would have had you killed before the police even arrived. By intervening, you guaranteed her wrath. Why risk your life for mine?" She swallowed hard, looking down at her lap. "I'm a sommelier, Mr. Costello. I respect the wine. I respect the craft. But more than that, you've always been decent to me. You remembered my name. In this world, that's rarer than a 47 Cheval Blanc. I couldn't let you die." Arthur stopped bandaging her hand. He looked up, his grey eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made the breath catch in her throat. His gaze slowly traced the curve of her jaw, the fullness of her lips, and the heavy swell of her chest heaving beneath her stained uniform. There was no disgust in his eyes. There was only a dark, consuming hunger that made her pulse roar in her ears. "My name is Arthur," he said softly, his thumb brushing against her uninjured knuckles. "And you are far too intelligent to be pouring drinks for these sycophants." He stood up, his demeanor snapping back to the calculating mob boss. "Here is the situation, Penelope. Victoria is playing a deep game, but there is a flaw in her design. A hit this bold. The Hastings family wouldn't authorize it. Her father, Richard, is too conservative. He wanted this marriage to solidify peace, not ignite a bloodbath." "So she's acting alone?" Penelope asked, wincing slightly as she flexed her bandaged hand. "Or with an outside backer," Arthur mused, pacing the marble floor. Suddenly, a memory sparked in her brain. "The smell," she blurted out. Arthur stopped. "What about it?" "The poison. I told you it smelled like bitter almonds and oleander, which is hydrocyanic acid. But there was a base note to it. Something sharp and abrasive. I couldn't place it downstairs because she was terrified. But I know what it is now." She stood up, her confidence returning as she stepped back into her realm of expertise. It was potato ethanol. Cheap, brutally distilled potato vodka, the kind that isn't filtered. She used it as a solvent to suspend the cyanide so it would mix seamlessly into the alcohol of the wine. Arthur's eyes went dark. "The Hastings are traditionalists. They import everything from Sicily. But the Volkov Bratva, they distill their own spirits in Brooklyn," she finished. Arthur's smile was terrifying, a predator baring its teeth. "She didn't just betray me. She betrayed her own father. She brokered a side deal with the Russians to wipe me out, and likely planned to overthrow Richard with Volkov muscle once I was out of the picture." He looked at her, a genuine awe in his expression. "You just handed me the key to my kingdom, Penelope." He walked over to a heavy oak desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a sleek, suppressed Heckler & Koch pistol, sliding it into the waistband at the small of his back. He threw a fresh, tailored black suit jacket over his shoulders to hide the holster and the bloodstains on his undershirt. "Stay here," Arthur commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It's completely secure." "No," she said, lifting her chin. Her legs were shaking, and her heart was pounding. But she wasn't going to hide. She slapped me. She called me a fat cow in front of 200 people. She tried to frame me for murder. I am not hiding in a bathroom while you finish this. I'm going with you." Arthur stared at her for a long, silent moment. The hard lines of his face softened just a fraction, a spark of pure admiration flaring in his eyes. "All right, Penelope," he murmured, Let's go crash a party. The mahogany doors of the private humidor swung open, revealing a den of apex predators. Richard Hastings, the ruthless patriarch of the Red Hook docks, sat rigidly in a winged leather chair. His son, Liam, paced like a keyed animal. In the center sat Donatelli, the untouchable head of the commission. And then there was Victoria, weeping calculated tears into a silk handkerchief, playing the traumatized victim in her ruined Dior gown. The performance ended the second. Penelope stepped out from behind Arthur's imposing frame. Victoria's face twisted into pure venom. "What is she doing here?" she shrieked. "Arthur, Lorenzo was supposed to put a bullet in this fat bitch's head." "Sit down, Victoria," Arthur commanded. His sub-zero whisper hit the room like a shockwave. Richard stood, flushing red. "My daughter survived an assassination attempt. Hand that woman over." "Your daughter," Arthur replied smoothly, pouring a measure of Macallan, "is a traitor and a sloppy amateur." In a blur, Lorenzo and 4 of Arthur's guards materialized from the shadows, their suppressed firearms instantly leveled at Liam's chest. Liam froze, raising empty hands. Arthur took a sip of scotch, his icy eyes locking onto Victoria. "5 minutes ago, my cane corso licked up the Cheval Blanc. Penelope supposedly laced. He suffered a massive coronary and died before I reached the cellar. That wine was loaded with enough hydrocyanic acid to kill a dozen men." Victoria gasped. "I am so sorry, but that proves it. She—" "Sit down," Arthur snapped. "Security footage confirms Penelope wasn't near the serving cart until she wheeled it in. But you hovered over that decanter for 60 seconds while Penelope was adjusting her vest. A distraction you caused." "You're lying!" Victoria cried. "He's fabricating this to break the alliance. He's using this oversized, disgusting pig to ruin us." "I wouldn't insult her," Arthur said dangerously. "Penelope possesses a sensory palate you could never comprehend. Tell them, Penelope." She stepped fully into the light. Her uniform was stained with wine and blood. Her size 18 frame, a stark contrast to the sleek billionaires. But her fear had burned away. "The poison was a lethal hydrocyanic compound," Penelope stated firmly. "But the cyanide didn't give you away, Victoria. It was the solvent. The poison was suspended in unfiltered potato ethanol. It smelled like violently distilled vodka. The Hastings family imports pure Sicilian grappa for their labs. You didn't use family resources. You used Russian resources. The Volkov Bratva," Arthur finished. "You brokered a deal with the Russians, promising them my territory. Once I was dead, you planned to use Volkov muscle to usurp your own father." "No, Daddy, it's a lie!" Victoria screamed. Donatelli's raspy voice finally broke his silence. "My enforcers intercepted a Volkov lieutenant an hour ago at the docks. He was boasting about a major shift in power happening tonight. You already caught the rat, Arthur." The silence was suffocating. Richard looked at his daughter with the cold gaze of a mafia don evaluating a lethal liability. Betraying blood was the one unforgivable sin. "Liam," Richard whispered. Liam immediately stepped away from his sister. "You betrayed your blood," Richard said, turning his back. "The alliance is broken. She is no longer a Hastings." Richard and Liam walked out. Victoria let out a primal scream, lunging toward a silver letter opener on the desk. Lorenzo was faster. His massive hand clamped down on her wrist, twisting brutally until a sickening snap echoed through the room. Victoria collapsed in agony. Donatelli nodded approvingly as Lorenzo dragged the sobbing woman out the side door. Suddenly, the room was empty. Just Arthur and Penelope. Her adrenaline crashed. Her legs gave out, and she sank into the leather settee. Arthur gently pulled her hands from her face, his thumbs brushing the tears from her cheeks. "I guess I'm out of a job," she whispered, gesturing to her heavy body. "The club won't want me now." Arthur's hands slid into her hair. "You're done pouring wine for people who don't deserve to breathe your air," he murmured. "You are brilliant, fiercely loyal, terrifyingly brave, and absolutely stunning." He leaned in, capturing her lips in a kiss that was a potent mix of fire and absolute possession. He pulled her heavy frame flush against his muscular chest, his hands mapping the curves she had always hidden, treating them like unearthed treasure. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "You're staying with me," Arthur promised, a vow sealed in the quiet aftermath of the storm. "As my partner, as my equal, and God help anyone who ever tries to make you feel invisible again." And there you have it, folks. Penelope went from an invisible sommelier to the undisputed queen of the Costello Syndicate, proving that brains, curves, and a killer instinct will always outsmart a toxic rival. Did you love this intense mafia romance as much as we did? If you were cheering when Victoria finally got caught, smash that like button. Share this story with your fellow drama addicts, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, high-stakes revenge stories. See you next time.